Good morning, everyone. It's been a couple weeks since we've spoken, but as usual, I'm very grateful that you came here to hear a few words of comment on our friends across the aisle and our institutions in general. Well, I regret saying it, but some of my worst fears are coming true. I'm looking at some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I'm starting to notice the telltale signs of power drunkenness. And that is of grave concern not only to me, but for the people of Indiana. I'm trying to, when I'm there in the front row, I try to look around me, sit back, and see what's developing in the entire picture. And there's a couple of troubling things. The first is an obvious effort to keep wages low. That is indisputable. We are seeing this, what once upon a time was the third rail of Indiana politics, the repeal of the common construction wage, one that ensures that people are paid fair wages on job sites, that we use Indiana workers for our public construction, and that we support our independent contractors here in this state. That's on the road to repeal, and that's going to drive down not only construction wages, but wages in the entire labor market. So that by itself is troubling. Probably not surprising, but also troubling is we saw the minimum wage voted down along party lines, a reasonable increase for the people at the very bottom of the economic rung. And by the way, I would note people that are working and avoiding taxpayer assistance. That was turned down. But an effort to even study the minimum wage was turned down. So on one hand, we see active efforts to drive down wages, and then we see an unwillingness to even look at the problem of wages and salaries. The next thing we see is solidifying power. They have all the power right now. To the extent that there's any dissenting voices in other parts of state government, they want to make sure that they are minimized and to the maximum extent eliminated. So that's a major problem, and that is a sign also of power intoxication. Then we see a continued effort to game elections. Nobody asked for election law to be changed, but now we're going to see these vote centers that are no longer going to require bipartisan consensus at the local level. They're now only going to require partisan action, and there's the opportunity to move voting locations further away from the voters. They want to take away options on the ballot that nobody asked to have taken away. And, if they want to do those things, fine. But at the same time, when there's efforts to try to make it easier for people to vote, maybe doing away with excuses for absentee voting or to shorten registration periods, those are turned down uniformly. So we don't see anything being done to fix the fact that Indiana was 50th in voter turnout. The next thing, we see these continued efforts, particularly in public education, to take our public assets and our public responsibilities and put them over in the hands of profiteers. The thing that is most bothersome to me, though, and those are all extraordinarily bothersome, what really seems to be delighting some of my friends across the aisle is just the opportunity to fan their own ideological vanities. I saw something on the floor of the House yesterday that absolutely shocked me, but I'm going to ask all of you to put on your history class caps for a second. We saw a member go up there and assail the gold standard. I didn't know that that was even a discussion anymore. Do you know the Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan was in 1896? So it was a little strange for somebody to go up there and talk about the gold standard with respect to wages, but even more troubling, he got applause from his caucus. That shows you how far we've drifted away from the problem solving and the practical solution making that is demanded by the people of Indiana. So again, what's the goal of all these things? Is it simply to just make sure that the campaign cash keeps flowing in? I don't know. Is the goal simply to fulfill the dreams of what people think about when they sit around in their armchairs and they read some of their favorite partisan-driven authors? I don't know. Is there a reaction that happens after they looked at some right-wing website? I don't know. but it's fulfilling some psychological need, which is difficult to understand. But the implication for the people of Indiana is not good, because we're not doing a single thing here to solve real problems for real people. We're not doing anything about college affordability. We're not addressing wages and salaries in a substantial way. This school funding issue continues to be a mess. I looked at the school runs from their budget in the biggest school corporations in Indiana, where most of the kids are still continuing to get cut. By the way, mine is one of them. And then finally, we see more obfuscation with our school funding. We had a vote for a very reasonable suggestion this week to put vouchers, charter schools, virtual charter schools, and traditional public schools in separate pots of money. Doesn't cost a dime other than ink. List them separately. Show the public what's being funded, what's being cut, what's being increased a little bit, what's being increased a lot. And that was turned down uniformly. And by the way, for arguments that are extraordinarily weak. We separate out funding for everything. That's why we have a budget. That's why it's 100 pages long. You thumb through it, and everything has a different purpose and a different function and a different number next to it. And when we talk about sort of unraveling this very confusing school funding problem, there's no interest in doing it, because I think that they probably understand the truth. And the truth is that more and more of the dollars are going to fewer and fewer people. So the good news, and I will end with some good news, is that we do have half a session left. There's the opportunity to correct some of these things. There's the opportunity for the supermajority to restrain itself from all of its most ardent fantasies and refocus on what some of the actual problems are here in Indiana. And by the way, I still have hope that there's enough pragmatic minds on the other side of the floor that that's possible. And I'm hopeful that there's some pragmatic minds over in the Senate. I don't think there's quite as many as there used to be, but there are a few, and fortunately there are prominent ones. So it's not hopeless yet, but we need to get out of this mindset, and we need to get back on solving real problems. And a little bit of bipartisan crossover probably would be helpful. So with that, I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
You shocked or surprised at any of what you're seeing right now, Scott?
Yeah, I'm a little. Shock and surprise are two different words. Okay, I'm not shocked, but I am surprised because I think that the speaker meant it when he said that the supermajority needs to exercise restraint. I think he believes that. I think that he understands that governing a state is extraordinarily difficult, and I think he knows that just because they have 71% of the members, that 71% of the people don't agree with them, and that there's a lot of competing interests, and there are people in all corners of Indiana that are suffering. I believe he gets it. We don't agree on the way to get there a lot of the time, but I think he gets it. I'm not sure that many of his members do, and the risk in the Republican caucus is that the ideologues reach a critical mass where they take over the whole thing, and then solving real problems is going to become impossible. Because, and I'm not going to name names obviously, but when you put yourself in an alternate reality, it becomes difficult to empathize with those with whom you don't agree. And when you get new pieces of information, you reject the information when it doesn't fit with the ideology. And I just pray that the pragmatists prevail.
Scott, with respect to the school funding formula, the chairman has said the ones that are getting cut are the ones that are still losing enrollment. How far should the state go in linking funding to enrollment?
Okay, well, again, this goes to a very fundamental problem. Everybody agrees that if you have growing enrollment, you probably need more teachers, and that probably requires some more resources. But at the same time, the school corporations and the communities that continue to lose money also have the most at-risk kids. And that requires additional consideration as well. Now, on any given year, we understand that not everyone comes out on the high end, and not everyone is advantaged by the school funding formula, but we've now seen sustained and ongoing periods of cut after cut after cut. And we were told that this problem was going to be fixed, and it's not. It's not. There are hundreds of thousands of kids throughout Indiana that are going to continue to see fewer teachers, growing classroom pressures, and environments where it's harder to learn. And by the way, some of those kids are kids for whom it's a struggle to even get to school every morning, and there are kids too. The problem's not fixed yet. I would submit to you that an easy thing to do would be to look back at the $300 million that former Governor Daniels cut from schools under an old school funding formula and give the money back. If you would give the money back, that would give breathing space to some of those schools. Simply restore the past cuts. Remember, there was $300 million that was found, Eric. Those cuts probably weren't even necessary when they were done. Give them the money back. And you know what? You'd see some school districts, some classrooms start to breathe a little easier. And the discordant chorus of those who are continually being asked to do more and more and more with less and less and less probably would subside a little bit.
You say you want to restore the $300 million that was cut 4 or 5 years ago now. Where do you get that money from?
Well, the governor the governor himself wanted to put an extra $200 million into the school funding formula. I mean, and I think the Republicans are wanting to do even more than that. That's a good thing, but we have to consider where the dollars are going as well. And if you took some of those dollars and restored many of the past cuts, by the way, which would also include schools that are benefiting from the school funding formula, I think you'd see an evening of the competing priorities that we have and the competing demands that have to be met. We've got growing school districts. We've got kids with a lot of problems, by the way, who are going to grow up to be our fellow citizens one day. And if we can find a better way of balancing those competing aims, I think we can have a better school formula. And I think an easy way to do that, in a simple way, and the one that the public would understand, would be to correct a past problem. And by the way, when those cuts were made, they were reported to be temporary. They were noted to be an act of desperation in a difficult economic time. We don't have as difficult of an economic time now. We can go back and correct that injustice.
Some of those school districts that were cut during that $300 million have since lost hundreds, in a couple of cases, thousands of kids. Should those school districts get all that money back, even though they're not serving nearly as many students anymore?
Well, you remember, Leslie, they're continuing to suffer deep cuts. I just talked to one the other day, and it's a big cut. That's not going to fix every problem. They're still going to have to figure out how to phase out their fixed costs. But we can make it easier for them because those costs are fixed. We don't, this money follows the child concept is wonderful in theory, but it really only works if every child walks around with an ATM strapped to their back. Other than that, there's buildings, there's heating bills have to be paid, there's staff that works there that, by the way, are part of their respective communities and make purchases at local businesses and have mortgages to pay. Those things matter. All we ask is make it a little bit softer.
Scott, should school districts, like Leslie fell back on Leslie's question, that have lost these hundreds, in some cases thousands of kids, particularly some of these smaller communities, look at more collaboration, more consolidation as a way to mitigate, some of these circumstances? I mean, when a school district has, all of 2,000 students, I mean, I had that many kids in my high school in Chicago. Right. I mean, how do you make that work?
I think that it's okay for schools to be able to consider economies of scale. I think cooperation's more important than competition when it comes to education. But these things need to be driven at the local level. Our pattern of just deciding everything from this particular building has got a lot of people up in arms. That's sort of the unwritten subtext to this whole school experimentation movement, is we're doing everything here on the floor of the House. We're making all the decisions in the basement of this building or across the street at the government center, and we're making it harder for school boards and local administrators just run their own schools. So we can unshackle some of those things, but we got to really be able to, we got to really be willing to do it. We can't just keep forcing problems upon them.
Why do you think there weren't amendments called to common construction when it was on seconds in the House?
Because it's too terrible to fix. It needs to be rejected in its entirety. There's no compromise to be had. And when I say there's no compromise, it's not because there's no willingness to compromise. One isn't mathematically possible. It has a severe effect on a significant part of Indiana's economy. And by the way, I will note, when you saw the testimony out there against that bill, those were businessmen. Those were not, those weren't people in hard hats. Those weren't people wearing sandwich boards. They were people that showed up in nice suits and ties and said, this is going to affect the business and the people that I pay here in Indiana. It's bad policy. It's for the purpose of rewarding out-of-state contractors and people that want to pay the lowest wage possible, that want to get the bid on the front end and then do shoddy work that's going to cost the taxpayers more in the long run. There's a reason it's been in place for many, many years, and there was a reason it has had cross-party support for many, many years. And and more directly to the question, the biggest reason it wasn't amended is we don't want to give harbor to those who might be on the fence. Okay, for there's a lot of hesitation across the aisle, and I expect there's going to be Republican votes against that bill. And I don't want to make it easier for them to vote yes.
How unusual was the Sunday sales bill yesterday in terms of not really being a political divide and Democrats voting against the amendment, some Republicans voting for? What does that say for...
Actually, okay, now thanks for asking about a nonpartisan issue. When that vote went up on the board, I slumped back in my seat. I looked over at my counterpart, Judd McMillan, and said, that was fun. And it was fun because that was probably the least partisan vote I can remember in quite some time. And everyone had a completely different philosophy on alcohol regulation. They've heard different things from their constituents. There were no caucus positions taken on either side of the aisle. You had longtime friends completely disagreeing. I thought it was good, and actually, despite many of the things that trouble me here, I think it's good for the institution, for the public, to have an issue like that once in a while, where you can completely throw the party hats out the door, completely throw the intra-party philosophies out the window, and have a good public policy discussion. Whether it was the optimal outcome, I don't know. What the future of the bill is, I'm not sure. But we'll probably have another interesting vote, my guess, on Monday, and there's probably going to be a very strange coalition built against it, and an even stranger one in favor of it.
Are you expecting something similar with gaming?
Yeah, gaming's another issue like that, no question. Now, that's become complicated a little bit. We're always looking for ways to ensure that our gaming industry is competitive. But now, the Ways and Means Committee and Chairman Brown threw a wrench into that bill by affecting the local revenue for the local units of government. So I don't know what the future of that piece of legislation is. It's going to be very tough. I would guess if anything does pass, it's going to come down to conference committee time, if you can keep a bill moving. And by the way, there's a big factor in gaming that is only whispered about, and that's Governor Michael Pence. We have no idea what he wants to do. He might veto the whole thing anyways if something gets down there. So that's going to be a long and winding road, and probably a lot of stories still to be written.
What do you make of the governor's level of involvement in the legislative process, and as he's getting ready to go out of state for some trips to the National Governors Association and CPAC? What do you make of those trips and his involvement so far this year? Well,
the governor is his involvement on a personal retail level is positive. To be able to talk to the governor, to share ideas, and I'm not talking about getting agreement, I'm just talking about sharing ideas, about being welcoming to individual lawmakers. At those things, I think he's pretty good. When it comes to wielding the power that governors wield in order to influence public policy, I'm a little bit more puzzled at times. You're wondering about whether something's going to face a veto. probably the alcohol one is another one. I have no idea what he has in store for that. So trying to operate in that, with that aura of uncertainty from the governor's office is a little bit tricky. And I do think that when I talk about the divide in the Republican caucus, about the, between the ideologues and the pragmatists, I'm not always sure quite where he falls. He seems to straddle both universes.
What do you think of the travel, political ambition storyline with the governor? Well,
he's not. If he does not harbor any national ambitions, in my opinion, he's not doing much to help his case. To me, it looks like he's still interested, and I still consider when he says something whether he's interested in a higher office, and I still consider whether he's talking as a governor of Indiana or whether he's talking as a prospective national figure. I wish he'd slam the door on it or open the door to it. And I can live with it either way. I would just like to know. So I would ask you to keep asking.
Speaking of governors,
are you looking to run for governor?
Well, I don't have, I've said this before, I don't have any interest in that. I will say that with respect to my party, I want somebody to step up and take the thing. I am a little concerned that, the whispers about various candidates and potential standard bearers for the Democratic message at times seems to be growing. It seems to be uncertain. I want somebody to step up and take the thing, and I want him to take it early, because that'll make our jobs easier here at the State House. We want to drive. We are dedicated to driving message for the middle class here in our legislative caucus. In order to most effectively do that, we need a clear statewide leader, and I want somebody to look at that goal and tackle it.
Should that person be Glenda Ritz?
Well, I don't have a name for who it should be, but it needs to be somebody. It needs to be somebody, and I'm a little concerned that there's not an obvious clear name yet, and that needs to be rectified sooner rather than later. And that may take force of will, and it may take boldness, but for the good of the middle class of Indiana, who I believe need an alternative voice to what we're seeing right now, somebody needs to do that. And the longer that it goes on, that won't be ideal for the opportunity to forge an alternative vision.
But could
Why not you?
Jim, I have a huge job to do here in this chamber, and I've got commitment to these members. I'm not thrilled about how the last election went. I feel an obligation to help folks here get that right, and to keep providing an alternative message for the people of Indiana, and that's absolutely all that I'm focused on right now.
This idea of you want somebody to grab that mantle. Have you been delivering that message to potential candidates?
I have delivered that message.
Could Superintendent Ritz be that person?
I think it could be, she could be that person. It could be other people who are very credible. It could be, John or Barron or anyone that's throwing their name up. But it's my preference as the leader of this caucus that somebody take it and somebody take it soon.
Can they wait till the end of the session?
Well, yes, they can.
Well, yeah. They can't fundraise anyway.
Yes, they can. But, and a lot of this depends on our own party, too. We have to, winning governor isn't going to be easy. But I got to tell you what, as much as we've taken on the chin the last couple elections, you forge a good message from the legislature, you make gains, you get back the chief executive's office here in this state, and all of a sudden you're having the opportunity to move the state in a new and positive direction. And by the way, in a practical problem-solving direction, a lot sooner than you may have expected.
Scott, going back to the gambling bill, can you give us your thoughts about what the changes would mean for your community? But on top of that, do you think that the state legislature has the ability to cancel contracts that these communities have signed with their local casinos.
Well, I will say that I get calls from home occasionally, and there's grave concerns about whether that's possible. You know, there was a social contract made with these communities a number of years ago, and it needs to be honored. They are vital to important parts of Indiana, and you can't simply pull those commitments away and expect that there aren't going to be implications for the state as a whole. Now, thinking of my own community, you know, we've suffered a lot of changes. We've seen employers come, we've seen employers go. We've been part of the national change in our manufacturing base. And those casinos have allowed people to keep working, and they've sustained our communities. Because, you know, I think about Blue Chip where I live. If those 1,200 or so folks weren't working there, I'm not sure where else they would be working at this point in time. So that's good. But, you know, we see things like massive property tax shortfalls. We see a struggle to keep up with maintaining local services so you can have a community and have the basics. And that revenue from those casinos is essential and is part of that. And to pull it away is something that it should really not be considered. And I think when you start going down that road, you're going to have it's going to be more and more difficult to make the kinds of practical changes for the casino industry that's going to let them keep competing in the decade ahead.
Back up even further to school funding. You mentioned the need to fund at-risk students. The budget, as it came out of Ways and Means, links that directly to free lunch. Is that too rigid? Is there if that's not the right way to do it, what's a better way?
You know, Eric, I'm not the world's foremost expert on the best way to do that. I just look at the outcome. You know, I get the school runs and I look at the bottom, and then I make assessments, and you still have many school corporations and the biggest school corporations here in Indiana still coming out on the short end. At the same time, we see that, you know, more and more vouchers, more and more charters. That's what the majority wants. They were elected to do that. But I think if we can start to unravel those things, we can start to understand what we're really doing better, and the public can understand it better. That's why I say, let's separate out the money. We've got to get to the point where we can make rational judgments. Once we can make rational judgments about where the money is going, then we can start to get back on the policy debates.
So in other words, if this is the answer, then something needs
This is the answer, then it's not a good enough answer yet.
Scott, looking at the governor's race in 2016, can Democrats win? I mean, Barack Obama 2008, Mitch Daniels won. You know, even with the whole 2012, Richard Murdoch, Tony Bennett situation, Mike Pence still won the governor's race. Why would 2016 be any different for you guys than 2012, 2008?
Well, there's no question we can win governor in Indiana. That's numerically we can do it. You've got plenty of middle-of-the-road folks here in Indiana that maybe vote Republican most elections, but not every election. And there's a message to be made to people. I mean, there's a lot of Indiana's uncomfortable with the solutions or lack of solutions being generated in the State House, and they're wondering what they're getting for their supermajorities, and everything's in the hands of one party. So there's absolutely a middle-of-the-road case to be made there. In addition to that, we don't run elections here in a vacuum. Believe me, I know that better as well as anybody. And you got to look at the potential Republican field for president. I know they're going to try to restrain themselves, but there's somebody that could be really a non-competitive non-starter at the top of their ticket, and that's going to have implications for state races here. No question. Things do still trickle down the ticket, even even well into the 21st century.
Is the Democratic gubernatorial ticket complicated by the fact that we don't technically know who the Republican nominee will be?
Yeah. Yes, but those are the kinds of complications you can't control.
Have you seen any changes in how the governor's dealt with the legislature now his third session, and has he been involved as you would expect him to be?
Well, that's sort of piggyback. I think Dan, you asked that a little bit earlier. He, like I say, he's very good at involvement on a personal level. On a policy level, he seems to be content to make grand pronouncements and then sort of leave the powers here in these two chambers to their own devices. That's a formula for being able to say the right things and not being overly concerned with whether you actually get them or not.
Does the whole debate over who chairs the State Board of Education affect the governor's race in 2016, or is that all too inside baseball to move votes?
It's not all inside baseball. Some of those are clearly inside 465 discussions, but not everywhere. Because when I go back home, there's a very active and angry part of the electorate that just believes stripping Glenn of her powers and what she was elected to do is the biggest outrage you can imagine, and they're motivated and they're upset. So among everyone, is it a huge issue? No. Among some, it's the biggest issue. So there's absolutely an intensity of opinion there in all corners of Indiana.
Are those voters that would already be voting Democratic, or does that have potential?
No. Actually, excellent question. No, they're not. That's what's interesting about it. One thing that the Republicans have gotten wrong is there's a lot of Republicans who really love public education, and they love their local school and their local rural school. They're proud of it. They were happy with the way they were run in the past. And they see these education wars and these ideological experiments as being really an affront to conservatism, and that's conservatism with a small c.
Scott, every most recent polling has had the governor north of 60%. An approval rate, and the realtors had him at 60. Americans for Prosperity had about 62, 63. Things like Ball State had him north of 60. How do you run against that? Because obviously to get those middle of the road voters to switch over, they got to think something's gone wrong. And even ISTA's own poll had the state 50% going in the right direction.
Being a bit of a historian here in India, now I haven't been around as long as Jim Shella, but I've been around a little bit. And
you live that long.
Yeah. But that's a soft 60. It is. Feelings may be vaguely positive about the governor, but they're not intensely positive. And in this state, historically, if you don't go out of your way to make people mad, regardless of who the governor is, they're probably going to toss you a 60% approval. But that's what campaigns are for, Abdul. Campaigns change those things, and that's where you find out how much people are willing to bleed for the guy that's in there now, and how much they believe in the opportunity for a different direction.